The rumble of the train had receded an hour ago, leaving Chen in the near absolute silence of the countryside. The journey from the bustling city had culminated at a desolate railway depot, a skeletal structure of rusted girders and weathered timber. No platform lights flickered. Only the distant guttural croak of a heron broke the quiet as Chen secured the last of the luggage into the back of the hired vehicle. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of deep creases, merely grunted, his gaze fixed on the winding, unlit track ahead. He seemed eager to depart. Chen understood the sentiment. The Chroma House, as it was known, held a reputation. Chen had spent weeks preparing for this. The solicitor's pronouncements had been clear, if unsettling. The great-aunt, a woman Chen had never met, had vanished without a trace over 30 years prior. The house, her sole legacy, had sat dormant, a sealed enigma. Now, it was Chen's. A flicker of something akin to resolve hardened Chen's jaw. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was an answer to a question no one had dared to ask for decades. The car moved, its headlights carving a tunnel through the oppressive rural blackness. The air, cool and damp, carried the scent of wet earth and something metallic, like rain on old iron. The road, initially paved, soon deteriorated into a gravel track, the tires crunching loudly. Chen watched the landscape shift from dense, skeletal trees to sparser, gnarled forms, their branches reaching like arthritic fingers. Then, through a sudden gap in the foliage, it appeared. The Chroma House. Even in the deep night, under a sliver of moon, its silhouette was arresting. It wasn't merely a house, it was a statement. It seemed less built than grown, an inorganic crystal formation thrust from the earth. No warm glow emanated from within. It stood as a monolithic, silent sentinel. The driver pulled up a respectful distance from the main entrance, a wide, low-slung portal of burnished steel. He didn't offer to help with the bags. Chen didn't press him. The transaction was purely functional. The steel felt cool and slick beneath the fingertips. There was no visible lock, only a subtle indentation. The key slid in with a soft, precise click, a sound that seemed to reverberate disproportionately in the quiet. The air inside was still and cool, carrying a faint, dry scent Chen couldn't quite place. Not dust, not mildew, but something mineral, like concrete after a long rain. Chen stepped across the threshold. The driver's vehicle, Chen noted, was already turning, its taillights receding quickly down the gravel path. Chen located a bank of switches near the entrance. With a click, the house responded. Light bloomed, not from conventional fixtures, but from hidden sources embedded within the walls and ceiling, casting a diffused, almost ethereal glow. The interior was as audacious as the exterior. Walls of polished obsidian met panels of frosted glass, which in turn abutted sections of what appeared to be raw, textured concrete. The angles were severe, the lines clean, yet there was a sense of organic flow, a subtle curve in the seemingly straight lines that hinted at something beyond mere geometry. The entrance hall stretched into a vast open space, leading to a series of interconnected rooms. Chen's footsteps, even muted by the heavy short-pile carpet, echoed with unnerving clarity. The silence was profound, absorbing sound. Chen's initial survey was one of detached curiosity. This was an architectural marvel, a testament to a singular vision. It felt like walking inside a sculpture. Chen moved deeper, exploring the first few rooms. A study, lined with empty shelves, offered a wide panoramic window overlooking the dense moonlit trees. Everything was meticulously preserved, as if the great-aunt had simply stepped out for a moment, decades ago. Each step was solid, yet the ascent felt weightless. Chen chose one at random, pushing it open. It revealed a spare bedroom, furnished with minimalist precision. Another door, further down, led to a washroom, sleek and functional. Returning to the corridor, Chen paused. A door, flush with the wall, stood where Chen was certain there had been only a continuous stretch of polished stone moments before. Chen's brow furrowed. Had Chen simply overlooked it? The corridor was long, yes, but not so complex as to hide an entire doorway. Chen distinctly remembered counting 4 doors on this side, and this was the 5th. A momentary prickle of unease threaded through Chen's composure. It was an old house, even if modernist in design. Quirks were to be expected. Perhaps a cleverly disguised utility closet, or a panel that blended too well with the wall. Chen reached out, the cool metal of the handle firm under their touch. It turned with a soft click, and the door opened into a small, windowless chamber. Inside, a single tall mirror stood against the far wall, its silvered surface reflecting only the room's muted light and Chen's own hesitant figure. Chen stepped into the small room, the air here feeling marginally cooler. The mirror was old, its glass possessing a faint, almost imperceptible ripple. Chen peered closer, examining their reflection. For a fraction of a second, just as Chen's gaze focused, the reflection seemed to waver, the features blurring, elongating, twisting into a grotesque caricature before snapping back to normal. It was a trick of the light, Chen decided, or perhaps the aged glass itself. The house was full of such optical plays, its angles and surfaces designed to challenge perception. Chen dismissed it, a faint smile touching their lips. A strange house, indeed, but nothing more. Still, as Chen backed out of the mirror room and pulled the door shut, the image of the fleeting distortion lingered. Chen was determined to uncover its secrets, but a subtle, unfamiliar tension had begun to coil in the pit of their stomach. Only the distant, guttural croak of a large bird disturbed the heavy quiet. Chen had stood there, a solitary figure amidst the rust and decay, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and disused metal. The last passenger car had vanished around a bend, leaving them truly alone. The drive to the Chroma House had been a slow, arduous progression along a track that barely qualified as a road. Dust billowed behind the rented utility vehicle, coating the sparse, hardy vegetation. The landscape grew increasingly desolate, the trees gnarled and ancient, their branches reaching like arthritic fingers against a sky that seemed perpetually muted. Then, through a gap in the dense canopy, it had appeared. The Chroma House. It was a stark interruption to the organic sprawl, a geometric assertion of will against the wilderness. Its angles were impossibly sharp, its planes a mosaic of materials that seemed to absorb and distort the ambient light. Inside, the house was a cavern of muted echoes. The air was cool, carrying the faint, dry scent of old paper and something metallic, like ozone. Chen's initial exploration had been methodical. The great aunt's furniture, sparse and modernist, was draped in white sheets, lending the rooms a ghostly, expectant air. Chen had removed the coverings from the living area first, revealing sleek, low-slung chairs and a glass-topped table. They had placed their worn leather satchel on the table's cool surface, then gone to unpack the single duffel bag in what they presumed would be the main bedroom. Upon returning to the living area a short while later, a small, anachronistic detail snagged Chen's attention. Their satchel. It was no longer on the glass table. Instead, it rested on the polished concrete floor beside one of the uncovered armchairs. Chen paused, a slight frown creasing their brow. They distinctly remembered setting it on the table. Perhaps in their distraction, moving through the unfamiliar space, they had simply misremembered. Or perhaps, in the process of pulling off the sheets, it had been nudged. It was a minor thing, easily dismissed. They bent, retrieved the satchel, and placed it back on the table, consciously noting its position this time. The rest of the afternoon was spent in a similar vein, a slow unwrapping of the house from its decades of slumber. Chen had moved from room to room, pulling back more sheets, uncovering more of the great aunt's peculiar aesthetic. The kitchen, a study in brushed steel and dark wood, felt cold and unwelcoming. The study, with its wall of empty shelves, seemed to exhale a quiet melancholy. They intended to retrieve a book from the satchel, but the satchel was not on the table. It was once again on the floor, precisely where Chen had found it earlier, beside the armchair. They stared at the satchel, then at the table, then back at the satchel. This was not a misremembrance. This was not an accident. They had consciously placed it on the table. A logical explanation eluded them. Had the house settled? Was there a draft they hadn't noticed, strong enough to dislodge a weighty leather bag? The windows were sealed tight, the air still. Chen's mind, accustomed to order and reason, sought immediate answers. Stress, they concluded. The long journey, the isolation, the sheer peculiarity of this inherited structure. It was all culminating in minor perceptual errors. They were tired. They needed sleep. Later that evening, after a sparse meal of instant noodles consumed in the echoing kitchen, Chen decided to review the house schematics left by the great-aunt's estate lawyer. They carried the rolled blueprints into the main bedroom, intending to spread them across the bed. But as they entered, they hesitated. The room felt different. The tall, narrow wardrobe, which Chen had earlier noted was flush against the far wall, now seemed to jut out by several inches, creating a sharper, more defined corner. The space felt marginally compressed. Chen stopped just inside the doorway, scanning the room. The bed was still centered, the bedside table still flanking it. But the wardrobe. It was definitely not as it had been. It felt solid, immovable. There was no gap between it and the wall, no indication it had been shifted. Yet the visual impression persisted. A subtle, almost imperceptible rearrangement of the room's geometry. This was more than a misplaced object. This was a spatial distortion, however minor. They closed their eyes, rubbing their temples. This was ridiculous. The house was designed with impossible angles, according to the estate documents. The human mind was highly susceptible to suggestion, to illusion. They were simply overstimulated, over-analytical. They unrolled the blueprints onto the bed, smoothing them with their palms. The lines were precise, the dimensions exact. They located the bedroom, tracing its outline. The wardrobe was indeed flush. Chen looked up, comparing the drawing to the physical room. The discrepancy, if it existed, was too subtle to be definitively proven by sight alone. Their internal clock felt skewed, their senses playing tricks. Chen froze, straining to hear it again. Nothing. It had been an auditory hallucination, a phantom sound born of fatigue and a heightened imagination. They were alone in a vast, silent structure, and their mind was clearly reacting to the isolation. The unease, however, had deepened its hold. The house, Chen realized, was beginning to feel less like a dormant inheritance and more like a patient, observing presence. Only the distant, guttural cry of an unseen bird punctuated the quiet. A black sedan, its paint dulled by dust, waited patiently beyond the depot's perimeter fence. The driver, a thin man with eyes that seemed to track nothing in particular, offered no greeting. Chen simply indicated the two worn suitcases, and the driver loaded them into the trunk with an economy of movement. The drive was long, the landscape outside the window slowly transitioning from fallow fields to dense, overgrown woods. The air in the sedan was stale, faintly metallic like old coins. Chen focused on the passing trees, their branches a tangled calligraphy against the bruised sky, attempting to organize the fragmented instructions for the house's alarm system, a sequence of numbers and symbols that felt increasingly arbitrary. When the house finally appeared, it was not a gradual reveal. One moment, the road was a tunnel of trees. The next, the colossal structure dominated the view. It was a stark, angular presence, a series of geometric planes in shades of muted gray and obsidian, jutting from the earth as if a shard of some impossible crystal had pierced the landscape. The driver merely stopped at the end of the long gravel driveway, nodded once, and then, without a word, turned the sedan around, its taillights receding into the encroaching twilight. Chen stood alone, the weight of the suitcases suddenly oppressive. A shiver, not entirely from the temperature, traced its way down Chen's spine. With a soft hiss, the door retracted into the wall, revealing an interior of polished concrete and soaring, unlit spaces. Chen navigated by the faint light filtering through the high, narrow windows. The great-aunt's furniture, when Chen finally located the central living area, was sparse and severe. Low-slung chairs, a brutalist coffee table, all arranged with a deliberate, almost ritualistic precision. Everything felt observed. Chen spent the remainder of the evening attempting to establish a sense of normalcy. The kitchen was a sterile expanse of stainless steel and sharp edges. Preparing a simple meal felt like an elaborate laboratory procedure. The angles of the walls seemed to sharpen, the planes of the ceiling to stretch. Chen found it difficult to recall the precise location of the bathroom, despite having used it only an hour prior. The hallway seemed longer, the turns more abrupt. It was in a small, windowless alcove, tucked behind a rotating wall panel that Chen had initially dismissed as purely decorative, that the great-aunt's private study was discovered. On it, stacked haphazardly, were several leather-bound journals and loose sheets of parchment. Chen approached the desk with a growing sense of anticipation, a nervous energy that vibrated in the fingertips. The journals were old, their covers cracked and brittle. But as Chen turned the pages, the script became increasingly erratic, the lines wavering, the words sometimes squeezed together, sometimes sprawling across the page. It watches through the glass, not the windows, the walls themselves. They absorb. One entry read, dated years before the great-aunt's disappearance. The angles, they are not fixed, they breathe. And I breathe with them. Chen's brow furrowed. This was not the work of a rational mind. The memories, they are not mine. The scent of lavender, a small boat on a lake. I never knew a lake. My sister. He was always afraid of water. Or was that a cousin? No, it was a friend. A childhood friend. Chen remembered the specific shade of blue of the great-aunt's eyes. A very particular, almost electric blue. But now, as Chen tried to hold the image, it wavered, shifting to a duller, more common gray. Had they always been gray? Chen felt a brief, disorienting flicker. No, blue. Definitely blue. But the certainty felt fragile, a thin pane of glass. A contact, a friend from university, Liam, was selected. The dial tone was a thin, reedy sound. "Hey, it's Chen," Chen said, the voice sounding small and distant, even to Chen's own ears. "Chen, long time. How's the house thing?" Liam's voice crackled, distant, as if from another continent. "It's a lot. Chen, I'm just trying to get settled." Chen hesitated. "Remember that time we went camping by the old quarry lake with the canoes?" There was a pause, a faint buzz on the line. "Camping? With canoes?" "Chen don't think we ever went camping, Chen. Chen mean you hated bugs. And Chen have never been in a canoe." Chen blinked. "No, we definitely did. It was summer after second year. You almost tipped us over." Another pause. Longer this time. "Are you okay? You sound a little off. Maybe you're just tired." The conversation drifted, became insubstantial. Liam's voice was fading, the details of their shared history suddenly vague, difficult to grasp. Chen ended the call, the phone feeling heavy and useless in the quiet. The great-aunt's journal lay open on the desk. The scent of lavender, a small boat on a lake. Chen looked around the austere study, the walls seeming to lean inward. The great-aunt had written of a lake she never knew. Chen had just been told of a camping trip that apparently never occurred. A subtle, insidious thread of doubt began to weave itself through Chen's perception of reality. The subtle, insidious thread of doubt Chen had felt in the study began to tighten, a cold knot in the gut. The great-aunt's phantom lake, the colleagues' forgotten camping trip. These were not simple memory lapses. They were fissures in the bedrock of reality, and Chen stood precariously on the crumbling edge. Leaving the study, the long corridor stretched before Chen, an expanse of polished concrete and pale, unadorned walls. It felt longer than before, the distant turn appearing to recede with each step. The air, already cool, now carried a faint metallic tang, like old coins left to oxidize in a damp space. As Chen walked, a peculiar phenomenon began on the left wall. What had been a uniform, matte surface started to shift. Fine, hairline cracks, barely perceptible at first, spiderwebbed across the concrete, then deepened, widening into dark, intricate channels. These channels didn't follow any natural stress lines. Instead, they formed deliberate geometric patterns. Impossibly sharp angles intersecting with organic, vein-like tendrils. The patterns seemed to bleed into existence, a slow, silent expansion, like ink spreading through a filter, but composed of the wall's own substance. The designs were unsettling, vaguely familiar yet alien, reminiscent of some ancient, forgotten script. A low groan emanated from somewhere above, not the settling of old timber, but a deep, resonant sound, like a vast mechanism shifting. Chen's gaze snapped upwards. There was no breeze, no open window. The movement was singular, isolated. The house was not merely old, it was actively hostile. A sudden thought, sharp and clear, pierced the growing mental fog. A package. A crucial delivery, long overdue, waiting at the railway depot. The great-aunt's last will had mentioned a specific sealed box, vital to understanding the house's construction, to be collected only by the inheritor. Chen hadn't remembered this before, but now the detail felt irrefutable, a forgotten imperative. Leaving the house, even for a short trip, seemed the only logical course of action. The air outside, the clarity of the city, might purge this creeping disorientation. The main entrance, Chen knew, was at the end of this current hallway, beyond a wide, arching doorway. The hallway continued. The doorway ahead, a distinctive arch of blackened steel, seemed no closer. The distance remained constant, mocking. A door previously closed and flush with the wall to Chen's right now stood ajar. Chen was certain no door had been there before. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for a new path, pulled Chen towards it. As Chen reached out a hand, the door swung inward silently, revealing not a room, but a continuation of the same hallway, bending sharply to the left. Chen hesitated, then stepped through, the initial hallway vanishing behind them as the door swung shut with a soft, final click. The geometric patterns from the previous hallway were absent here, replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible undulation in the wall surface, like ripples in water, but frozen in place. Then Chen saw it. At the far end of the new hallway, where it should have opened into a larger foyer leading to the main exit, the wall buckled. Not subtly, not like the patterns, but with a visceral, sickening lurch. A section of the concrete, perhaps 3 meters wide, began to ripple and distend, pushing outward like a slow-motion breath. The surface stretched, then concave, then convex, the material seeming to lose all rigidity, flowing like thick gray molasses. Dust motes, caught in the low light, danced around the warping surface. There was no sound of crumbling, no cracking, only the silent, impossible distortion of solid matter. Chen stopped dead, breath catching in their throat. This was not an illusion. The house was changing, overtly, impossibly, right before their eyes. The wall pulsed once more, a final, deliberate heave, before settling back into a flat, solid surface. But it was not the same. Where a large, ornate ventilation grate had been, there was now only smooth, unbroken concrete. The exit was gone. The railway depot, the package, the city outside, all receded into a fog of unreality. The house had moved. The house had blocked the way. This structure was alive, and it did not want Chen to leave. Chen's fingers, smudged with graphite and the faint scent of aged paper, traced the spidery script across another one of the great aunt's journals. The study, usually a refuge of quiet concentration, now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a carefully constructed trap. Outside, the house hummed, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in Chen's bones, a sound that had become a constant, unsettling companion. The initial thrill of deciphering the great aunt's genius had curdled into something colder, something akin to dread. The entries grew progressively less about architectural innovation and more about a peculiar, intimate relationship with the structure itself. Phrases like, the house's nascent awareness, and its hunger for impression, appeared with increasing frequency, no longer metaphorical, but stated with a chilling, clinical certainty. The great aunt hadn't just built the house, he had nurtured it, understood its strange, parasitic nature. One entry, dated years before her disappearance, described the sourcing of specific materials. The steel, reclaimed from the derelict railway depot, held a memory of constant motion, of lives passing. It proved especially receptive, a skeletal framework for the house's nascent consciousness. Its resonant frequencies, amplified by the crystalline panels, established the initial current. Chen paused, the mention of the railway depot a sudden, concrete anchor in the abstract horror. It wasn't just a house. It was an organism built from scavenged history, its very foundations imbued with a purpose far beyond shelter. The great aunt hadn't been a victim. He had been a midwife, perhaps even a parent to this entity. Chen flinched, the sound jarringly normal, a shard of the outside world piercing the house's quiet dominion. It was the repairman, scheduled to inspect the archaic heating system. Chen had almost forgotten. Stepping into the hall, the air felt perceptibly cooler, the light from the stained glass panels casting a mosaic of fractured color across the polished floor. The repairman, a burly figure with a worn toolbox, offered a polite, if wary, smile. Afternoon. For the furnace, I assume? Yes, it's temperamental, Chen managed, the word feeling inadequate. The repairman nodded, his eyes scanning the impossible angles of the entrance hall, a flicker of professional curiosity mixed with something else, perhaps bewilderment, crossing his face. Remarkable place you've got here. Never seen anything quite like it. Chen directed him to the utility room in the basement, a space that felt unusually stable, devoid of the house's more overt manipulations. I'll be in the study if you need anything. Returning to the great aunt's writings, Chen found it impossible to focus on the technical details of the house's feeding cycles and perceptual harvesting. The repairman's presence. The house had already taken so much from Chen, memories, certainty, but always subtly, always deniably. What would it do to a fresh mind, a visitor? The great aunt's words echoed. The house finds new minds, particularly stimulating. An hour passed, then another. The rhythmic clang of tools from the basement had ceased some time ago. The repairman should have emerged by now, or at least called out. Chen descended the winding, unlit staircase to the basement. No response. Pushing the door open, Chen found the repairman. His eyes were wide, fixed on some unseen point directly in front of him, yet utterly vacant. A thin film of saliva coated his lower lip. His hands lay limp in his lap, fingers slightly curled, as if still holding an invisible wrench. His breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. Chen knelt, extending a hand, then recoiled before making contact. The man was present, yet completely absent. A profound, terrifying emptiness emanated from him. The house hadn't killed him. It had consumed him, leaving only the shell. The truth solidified in Chen's mind, stark and undeniable. The great ant hadn't been a victim, not in the traditional sense. He had understood the house, perhaps even revered its terrible power. He had observed its feeding, meticulously recording its effects, not as a horrified witness, but as a dedicated chronicler, a collaborator. This house wasn't just a structure. It was a hungry, sentient entity, and Chen was trapped within its walls, a new source of sustenance. Escape was no longer a viable option. There was only understanding, and then, inevitably, confrontation. The hum of the house seemed to deepen, a satisfied purr. The rhythmic clang of tools had not merely ceased, it had been erased. The silence that descended was not the absence of sound, but a presence. A thick, suffocating blanket that pressed against Chen's eardrums. An hour had bled into 2, then 3. The repairman had not emerged. No call had come. A cold knot tightened in Chen's stomach, a familiar sensation now, a constant companion since arriving at the Chroma House. The house felt heavier, its impossible angles seeming to lean inward, as if exhaling a profound, satisfied breath. Chen's determination, however, was a stubborn, sharp-edged thing. They needed to understand. They needed to impose order. The house thrived on chaos, on the unraveling. Chen would resist. Armed with a laser measuring device, a fresh notebook, and a mechanical pencil, Chen began. The plan was simple. Map the entire structure, room by room, corridor by corridor. Establish a baseline, then track the shifts. Rationality, Chen believed, was the only weapon against the insidious unreality. They started on the ground floor, in the main living space. The laser beam cut precise lines across the polished concrete, reflecting off the iridescent panels that shifted color with the ambient light. 32 feet, 4 inches. A quick sketch in the notebook. Then the adjacent room, a space Chen remembered as a study. 21 feet, 8 inches. The measurements felt solid, reassuring. For a brief period, the act of precise documentation offered a fragile sense of control. Chen moved with purpose, the click of the laser and the scratch of the pencil the only sounds in the vast, quiet house. But the reassurance began to fray. A corridor Chen had measured at 40 feet now registered as 43. A minor discrepancy, perhaps a misread. They remeasured. 43 feet, exactly. Chen frowned, erasing the original entry. A simple error. Then the kitchen. Its dimensions were consistent, but the window overlooking the rear garden, which Chen distinctly remembered being centered on the wall, was now noticeably offset, closer to the corner. Chen's hand trembled slightly as they sketched the new position. A hallway Chen had traversed multiple times, leading directly to the rear staircase, now branched off into an unfamiliar narrow passage that ended abruptly in a blank, featureless wall. It was not a door, not a panel, simply a sudden solid end where none should exist. It felt real, immovable, yet it was impossible. The laser measure became an instrument of torment. Chen would measure a wall, record it, then immediately remeasure, only for the number to fluctuate by inches, sometimes feet. A room that had been perfectly square now presented a trapezoidal aspect. The ceiling height in one area seemed to undulate, higher at one end, lower at another, defying gravity and logic. Chen's breathing grew shallow, ragged. The pencil pressed so hard against the paper that its lead snapped. They found themselves back in the main living space, the starting point. Chen held the laser measure steady, aiming it across the room. Exactly as before. A wave of relief, then confusion. Had it all been an illusion? A trick of light? Or Chen's own exhausted mind? They turned, aiming the laser at the wall leading to the study. The display flickered, 24 feet, 9 inches. Chen stared at the number, then at their notebook. The original entry for that wall was 21 feet, 8 inches. A 3-foot discrepancy. Not a trick, not a mistake. This was not merely disorientation. It was active resistance. The house was not just changing. It was fighting Chen's attempt to comprehend it, to pin it down with numbers and lines. The more Chen struggled, the more the house seemed to mock them, twisting familiar spaces into impossible geometries. A deep, unsettling hum seemed to emanate from the very walls, a low vibration that Chen felt more than heard, a resonance that pulsed with their own rising frustration. The page was a chaotic mess of overlapping lines, erased numbers, and question marks. The effort to impose order had only created a deeper, more profound disorder within Chen's own mind. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. A childhood trip to the old railway depot with a relative. The vast, echoing space. The intricate network of tracks, each line leading definitively to a destination. Now, even that memory felt warped. The tracks seeming to curve back on themselves, leading nowhere. A subtle shift in the house's atmosphere prickled Chen's skin. It was not a temperature change, nor a new smell, but a palpable sense of heightened awareness, almost a presence. As Chen's mind reeled, trying to reconcile the irreconcilable, a sickening realization bloomed. The house felt fuller. The deep hum intensified, a low, contented thrum. It was feeding on the frantic, desperate energy of a mind trying to force its perception onto a reality that refused to be ordered. The house consumed the very act of trying to understand it, metabolizing the effort to impose structure, thriving on the frustration and the fear born of incomprehension. Chen gripped the laser measure, its plastic casing suddenly feeling alien and useless. The house had absorbed the repairman, and now it was absorbing Chen's sanity, one impossible measurement, one forgotten corridor, one rewritten memory at a time. The air around them felt thick, charged with the house's silent, ravenous satisfaction. Chen was not just mapping a house, they were mapping their own dissolution. The silence, once a mere absence, had grown into a tangible weight, pressing against Chen's inner ear, a dense, sound-absorbing medium that seemed to leach the very air from the rooms. 3 hours had passed since the last faint clang of tools. 3 hours since the repairman had effectively ceased to exist within the house. Chen moved through the corridors, a phantom in their own dwelling calling out, a low, uncertain sound that the house swallowed without echo. Each door opened to an empty room. Each corner rounded revealed only another stretch of unfamiliar angles that had once been familiar. The air felt colder, or perhaps it was Chen's own internal temperature dropping, a creeping chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat. A profound weariness settled into Chen's bones, a fatigue born not of physical exertion but of relentless psychological pressure. Yet, beneath it, a stubborn resolve flickered. This house wanted something, and Chen would not surrender their mind to it without understanding. The repairman's disappearance was not a random event. It was a deliberate act, a tightening of the snare. The large floor-to-ceiling windows, which typically offered a view of the overgrown garden, now showed a blurred expanse of gray, as if the world outside had dissolved into a perpetual twilight. Chen turned away, a tremor running through their arm. It was then, near what had once been a seldom-used utility closet, that they noticed a door. It was unassuming, a plain wooden panel set flush into the wall, entirely out of place amidst the house's usual geometric theatrics. It simply was. A cautious curiosity nudged Chen forward. The handle, a simple brass knob, turned without resistance. Inside, the room was small, perhaps 6 by 8 feet. It was a study or a library, long forgotten. Dust motes danced in a single shaft of natural light that pierced a small rectangular window set high on the wall. The air, surprisingly, was still and dry, devoid of the house's usual metallic tang, or the faint, unidentifiable scent of something decaying. A heavy wooden desk, scarred with age, occupied the center, laden with old books and a single ornate inkwell. A comfortable, if threadbare, armchair sat beside it. Chen stepped inside, the floorboards solid beneath their feet, not creaking or shifting. The walls were lined with bookshelves, crammed with leather-bound volumes, their titles faded but legible. There were no impossible angles here, no walls that seemed to lean inward, no doorways that appeared to shrink or expand. A fragile hope unfurled in Chen's chest, a desperate, irrational belief that they had found a place of respite, a blind spot in the house's perception. It was a familiar, if distant, vista. The distant, faded red brick of an old building, the skeletal framework of a water tower, and the glint of parallel steel lines. The railway depot. Chen remembered it, a landmark from their childhood, visible from their great-aunt's property, though never this clearly, and certainly not from this side of the house. A faint, rhythmic clack-clack-clack reached them, the sound of an approaching train, a distant, reassuring thrum of life. A memory surfaced, warm and vivid. Chen, a child standing with their great-aunt at the very edge of their property, watching a freight train rumble past, the ground vibrating beneath their small feet. The great-aunt had pointed, explaining the purpose of each car, her voice gentle, patient. It was a memory of connection, of shared experience, a moment of profound peace. Chen smiled, a genuine smile, the first in days. Then, the train's sound shifted. The clack, clack, clack became too precise, too uniform, like a recording on a loop. The railway depot, which had seemed so clear a moment ago, now appeared subtly wrong. The red bricks of the building seemed to bleed into the gray sky, and the water tower's frame twisted, not into an impossible shape, but into something vaguely threatening, like the skeleton of a predator. Chen leaned forward, a prickle of unease replacing the warmth. The memory, too, began to unravel. The great-aunt's face, so clear a moment ago, blurred, her features indistinct. On the desk beside Chen, an old, leather-bound photo album lay open. Chen hadn't noticed it before. They picked it up, their fingers trembling. Inside, sepia-toned photographs depicted family gatherings, holidays, birthdays. Chen recognized their own younger face in several, but the faces of the others. They were subtly wrong. A cousin had an extra finger. In one picture, a young Chen stood beside a figure with their great-aunt's clothes but a stranger's gaunt face. A face that was both familiar and utterly alien. Chen flipped through the pages frantically, seeking a single, untainted image. But each photograph was a betrayal. Events that Chen remembered with absolute clarity were depicted with crucial alterations. A family picnic at the lake showed them standing alone in an empty, desolate field. A birthday party was now a solitary figure staring at a cake with unlit candles. The memory of the railway depot, so precious moments ago, was now a fractured, unreliable thing, blending with the shifting images in the album until Chen could no longer distinguish truth from fabrication. This wasn't a safe zone. It was a deeper trap, a surgical strike at the very core of their identity. The house wasn't just distorting space. It was rewriting history, consuming the very fabric of Chen's self. The train outside continued its relentless artificial rhythm, a metronome counting down the moments until Chen's mind became an empty vessel. Chen squeezed their eyes shut, trying to grasp at a true memory, any memory, but they were all tainted, all dissolving. A profound disorientation took hold, a terrifying sense of not knowing who they were or where they had come from. The books on the shelves seemed to leer, their contents unknown, perhaps never having existed. Chen's will, once defiant, now wavered, teetering on the precipice of utter collapse. 3 hours had passed since the last faint clang of tools. 3 hours since the repairman had effectively ceased. Chen stood in the utility room, a space that now felt impossibly vast, the air thick with an unspoken finality. The lingering scent of ozone and something vaguely metallic clung to the air, a phantom residue. A cold certainty settled over Chen. The house had absorbed the repairman just as it had absorbed others. The thought did not bring panic, but a stark, almost clinical resolve. Chen had been pushed to the edge, but instead of breaking, something hardened. The house wanted to consume perception, to twist reality until nothing remained but a malleable, empty shell. But Chen would not be an empty shell. Chen would turn the house's own mechanisms against it. A memory, faint and flickering like a dying bulb, surfaced. A cryptic note from the great-aunt's desk, half erased by time and perhaps the house itself. Depot. Material. Core. It had seemed nonsensical then, a fragment of delirium. The great-aunt had been a collector, an eccentric, and her notes often veered into the opaque. But depot, that was specific. Chen remembered an old, disused railway depot on the outskirts of the city, a place the great-aunt had mentioned once, long ago, as a source for unusual acquisitions. The decision was swift, born of desperation and a newfound clarity. Chen had to leave the house, if only for a short while, to find the missing piece of the puzzle. The walk through the house felt different now. Each distortion was a layer, a filter. If the house fed on perception, then the key was to perceive beyond the intended illusion. Stepping outside, the world was a muted echo. The sky was an indifferent gray, the sounds of distant traffic oddly muffled. Even the breeze felt thin, anemic. It was as if the house had cast a subtle pall over the surrounding environment, a psychological residue that clung to Chen's senses. The drive to the old railway depot was a blur of unease. The streets seemed to stretch longer than they should, familiar landmarks appearing subtly altered, their colors desaturated. Chen gripped the steering wheel, focusing on the physical sensation, the hum of the engine, anything to anchor to a concrete reality. The railway depot loomed, a sprawling skeletal structure of rusted iron and crumbling brick. Chen pushed open a heavy, grimy door that groaned in protest, the sound echoing endlessly in the cavernous space. Inside, rows of derelict carriages sat like sleeping beasts, shrouded in dust and cobwebs. Empty storage units lined the perimeter, their steel doors scarred and dented. Chen walked among the forgotten relics, searching for a sign, a clue. The great-aunt had been meticulous, even in her strangeness. There had to be something. Chen's gaze swept over the names painted on the storage units, most faded beyond recognition. Then, a smaller, more recent stencil caught Chen's eye. AC, Section 7. AC, Adeline Chen, the great-aunt. The door to Section 7 was secured with a heavy, old-fashioned padlock. Chen, anticipating this, retrieved a set of bolt cutters from the trunk of the car. The snip was loud, sharp, a metallic shriek that reverberated through the vast space. With effort, Chen pried open the trunk. But it was not these that held Chen's attention. Nestled amongst the papers was a small, perfectly smooth, obsidian-like shard. It was cool to the touch, impossibly dense, and seemed to absorb the ambient light. It was not a natural stone. It was a fabricated material, unlike anything Chen had ever seen. A single stark phrase was etched onto its surface, barely visible. The perceptual weave. One of the journals, open to a marked page, contained the great-aunt's frantic, elegant script. It spoke of a material that listened to thought, that responded to expectation. A material that formed the very bones of the Chroma House. It was not merely a building material. It was a conduit, a receptor. The great-aunt had experimented, pushing its limits, until it had achieved a terrifying sentience, feeding on the very minds that inhabited its walls. The house didn't just have a core. The house was the core, woven from this perceptual weave, and its true heart was where the weave was densest, most concentrated, where the distortions originated. The house wasn't an entity in a location. It was the location itself, composed of this material. The core wasn't a hidden room, but a nexus of this weave. Returning to the house, the distortions were no longer disorienting. They were patterns, visible threads in a vast, terrifying tapestry. Chen saw the shimmering edges of reality, the subtle blurs where the house actively manipulated perception. This was the embrace of chaos, not to succumb, but to see it, to understand its mechanics. As Chen stepped through the front door, the house recoiled, or perhaps it intensified its assault. The air thickened, buzzing with an invisible current. Colors bled from the walls, then surged back in impossible, clashing hues. The floor beneath Chen's feet began to undulate, subtly at first, then with increasing violence, like walking on a churning sea. Memories flickered. Chen saw a childhood home that was not Chen's, a family that was not Chen's. Faces twisted and reformed in the periphery of vision, fleeting glimpses of forgotten people. The house was attempting to erase Chen's very identity, to dissolve the anchors of self. It twists reality. Chen pushed through the shifting hallway, the walls pressing inward, then receding to impossible distances. The floor tilted sharply, forcing Chen to brace against a doorway that suddenly felt like rough-hewn stone. The mind is a feast. Perception is sustenance. Dissolve. Dissolve. The house was fighting, violently, desperately. It sensed Chen's understanding, the breach in its carefully constructed illusion. The sensory overload was immense. The clashing colors, the discordant sounds, the sickening lurch of the floor, the phantom sense of decay and ozone. The core was not a place to hide, but a place to confront, to unravel the weave itself. And Chen was closer now, sensing its throbbing, distorted heart. The house roared, a cacophony of screeching metal and splintering wood that existed only within Chen's skull. The floor beneath their feet pitched violently, not in a physical lurch, but a profound disassociation that made their stomach clench. Colors bled, not just on the walls, but in the air itself, sickly greens clashing with searing magentas, creating a visual static that stung the eyes. They understood now. The house didn't just distort reality. It was reality. A predatory consciousness that devoured stable perception, feasting on the structured order of human thought. To defeat it, Chen couldn't fight its illusions directly. They had to starve it, or perhaps overload it. The corridor twisted, the walls undulating like vast, strained muscles. The air grew heavy, humid, carrying the distant, rhythmic thrum of something immense and industrial. Each step was a battle. The floor became slick with a viscous, unseen substance. The air grew cold, then hot, flickering with an unbearable pressure. Chen clenched their jaw, focusing on the rhythmic thrum, a sound that grew louder, more insistent, pulling them deeper into the house's psychological maw. It wasn't a room, but a vast, impossible expanse that stretched into a haze of perpetual twilight. This was the house's true heart, Chen realized, a nexus of all the fractured perceptions it had consumed. And here, in its terrifying core, the house manifested its raw, unadulterated essence. A railway depot. Immense, skeletal structures of rusting iron crisscrossed overhead, disappearing into the low-hanging gaseous gloom. Tracks, countless and parallel, stretched into the infinite distance, glinting wetly under the faint, diffused light. The air vibrated with the phantom shriek of brakes and the mournful wail of distant train whistles. The smell of coal dust and metallic tang was overpowering, clinging to Chen's throat. It was a place of endless transit, of arrivals and departures that never truly happened. a perfect metaphor for the fragmented minds trapped within. Chen saw them then, not people, but presences. Shimmering, translucent forms moved along the spectral platforms, indistinct and wavering like heat haze. A hand reached out, then dissolved. A face, contorted in a silent scream, flickered into existence on a distant carriage window before blurring away. These were the echoes, the raw data of minds absorbed, endlessly replaying their final moments of coherent thought within the house's digestive system. The true horror was not death, but this eternal, fragmented existence. A perpetual journey on tracks that led nowhere. This was the house's great reveal. It didn't just consume, it archived. Every mind, every memory, a spectral passenger on an infinite train. A wave of despair threatened to crush Chen. How could one mind fight such an overwhelming collective? The house fed on stable perception. It thrived on the predictable patterns of thought, the linear progression of memory. To starve it, Chen had to become chaos itself. Chen closed their eyes, then opened them, forcing their gaze to dart erratically, refusing to focus on any single point. They began to hum, a discordant, shifting melody, then spoke aloud, a stream of non sequiturs, nonsense words, conflicting commands. Red is green, up is down, remember tomorrow, forget now. They walked, not in a straight line, but in zigzags, circles, suddenly reversing direction, their movements jerky and unpredictable. The house recoiled. The rhythmic thrum of the depot faltered, stuttered. The phantom train whistles became distorted, like a record skipping. The translucent forms on the platforms began to flicker more violently, some dissolving entirely, unable to maintain their cohesion in the face of Chen's deliberate perceptual anarchy. Chen pressed their advantage, pushing deeper into the mental onslaught. And Chen was introducing a surge of pure, unadulterated static, flooding every channel. They forced their mind to generate paradoxes. A train arriving and departing simultaneously. A track that led to its own beginning. A signal light that was both red and green. The effort was immense, a profound strain on their very being. Chen felt their own sanity fraying at the edges, a constant, dizzying pressure threatening to crack their skull. Their ears rang with the feedback loop of their own chaotic thoughts amplified by the house's desperate struggle. The railway depot groaned. The iron structures above began to warp, bending at impossible angles, then straightening, then bending again. The ground trembled, not with the weight of phantom trains, but with the house's internal shuddering. It was choking on the chaos, unable to process the indigestible torrent of unstable perception. It had wanted order, pattern, memory. Chen was giving it a tempest of unmemory, anti-logic. A high-pitched whine like tortured metal began to emanate from the very air. The spectral figures on the platforms wailed, their silent screams now audible, thin and piercing. The entire vast space seemed to contract, then expand, a rapid, sickening oscillation that threatened to tear Chen's own perception apart. But they held on, a determined anchor in the storm, continuing their deliberate, maddening dance of perceptual disruption. The house was fighting, but it was also weakening. The cacophony inside Chen's skull did not abate, but it shifted. The screeching metal and splintering wood did not cease. They merely reconfigured, forming a new internal architecture of sound. Chen stood, unmoving, as the air thickened around them, heavy with the scent of ozone and something metallic. A tang like old blood mixed with iron filings. The impossible angles of the Chroma House no longer twisted into familiar domestic spaces. Instead, they stretched, elongated, becoming vast, echoing tunnels. The smooth, experimental materials rippled, losing their pristine sheen, taking on the pitted, worn texture of aged concrete and corrugated steel. When Chen finally opened their eyes, the transition was complete. They were no longer in the house, or rather, the house was no longer a house. It was a railway depot. The space was immense, cavernous, the ceiling lost in a perpetual gloom far above. Rivets the size of Chen's fist studded immense girders that crisscrossed overhead, supporting nothing visible, yet groaning under an unseen weight. The air was cold, carrying the distinct, acrid scent of coal dust and forgotten grease, a smell that scraped at the back of Chen's throat. A low, persistent rumble vibrated through the cracked concrete floor, a phantom rhythm that suggested heavy machinery moving just beyond the periphery of their vision, or perhaps just beyond the edge of their current reality. The tracks themselves were unsettling. They were too thin, too sharp, like razor wire laid out in parallel lines, reflecting the ambient dimness with a faint metallic gleam. There were no trains, no rolling stock, only the silent, waiting expanse of the tracks themselves, leading to nowhere Chen could discern. A profound exhaustion settled over Chen, a weight that pressed down on their eyelids and blurred the edges of their vision. Their limbs felt heavy, their movements slow and deliberate, as if wading through a viscous medium. Yet, a strange clarity pierced through the fatigue. The fear, which had been a frantic, suffocating thing, had receded, replaced by a quiet, unsettling awe. The house had not consumed them. It had merely changed them. Chen began to walk, their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the vast emptiness. They passed immense, rusted storage containers, stacked precariously high, their surfaces smeared with unidentifiable stains and faded stencils. The numbers painted on them were illogical, sequences that broke off abruptly or repeated in disorienting patterns. Chen tried to read one, a faded 7B92, but the next container was marked XG7X, and the one after that, simply X. Then, a flicker. At the end of one of the track lines, where the gloom was thickest, Chen perceived a form. It was massive, hulking, vaguely locomotive-shaped, but wrong. Its surface wasn't metal. It was a patchwork of muted, shifting colors. The very hues that had bled from the walls of the Chroma House. It pulsed faintly, a slow, deep throb that matched the internal vibration Chen felt. It wasn't a train. It was a dormant heart, a colossal resting entity. The house didn't merely warp perception. It became the things it absorbed, transforming into the very concepts and environments it had imprinted on its victims' minds. The railway depot was not a random hallucination. It was a manifestation, a physical echo of countless journeys, departures, and arrivals, perhaps even the final one-way trip of the great-aunt's own consciousness. The metal was real, rough beneath their fingertips, yet as their fingers traced its surface, they saw faint, shimmering lines, like residual energy. These lines were not part of the metal. They were superimposed, a new layer of reality Chen could now perceive. They pulsed with the same subtle chromatic shifts that had been the house's signature. The house was not defeated. It was merely quiescent. It had gorged itself, not just on memories and perceptions, but on the very idea of escape, of movement, of transition. The railway depot was its current form, a vast, waiting maw. And Chen, standing within its belly, felt a profound, unsettling connection to it. As they looked around, the outlines of the girders, the edges of the storage containers, even the distant, impossible locomotive seemed to carry a faint, iridescent halo. The world was no longer solid, no longer entirely predictable. Chen felt the subtle internal throb of the dormant house, a constant, quiet presence in their mind. They had survived, but survival had come at a cost. The world, for Chen, would never be just the world again. It would always be an echo of the Chroma House, a landscape subtly warped, forever on the verge of shifting into something else. They were free, perhaps, but they carried the prison within. The form at the end of the track lines coalesced, its scale immense, dwarfing the metal carcasses that lined the railway depot. It was not merely locomotive-shaped, it was a locomotive, yet its surface defied the properties of metal. Instead, a patchwork of muted, shifting colors adhered to its impossible contours. The exact hues that had bled from the Chroma House walls, now seemingly stitched together, forming a skin that pulsed with a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm. Chen felt a cold precision settle in their chest. This was not a memory, not a hallucination. This was a presence, an extension. The air around it was still, heavy, devoid of the usual depot smells of oil and rust. It absorbed sound, creating a pocket of profound quietude that pressed against Chen's ears. As Chen watched, a segment of the colored surface, a deep indigo, rippled, then seemed to detach, floating for a moment before readhering itself to another part of the colossal form, a pale ochre now replacing the indigo's former position. It was a slow, deliberate rearrangement, like a vast organic puzzle assembling itself without a visible hand. This was the house, or at least a manifestation of its core mechanism, its appetite given physical form. It was consuming, processing, reconfiguring. Chen's determination solidified. Escape was the only imperative. There was no understanding this thing, only withdrawing from its influence. Each shifting color on its surface seemed to tug at the edges of Chen's vision, threatening to unravel the concrete reality of the depot itself. Chen turned, not running, but moving with a swift, calculated urgency. The tracks, previously solid underfoot, now seemed to undulate slightly, the gravel shifting with a soft, almost wet sound. They moved past the skeletal remains of freight cars, their metal skins now reflecting the depot's dim light with an unnatural sheen, as if coated in a thin, iridescent film. Chen did not look back. Reaching the exit, a gap in the corrugated iron wall, Chen pushed through the heavy, rusted door. It groaned, a sound that seemed to stretch and distort, echoing longer than it should have. Chen took a deep breath, filling their lungs with the scent of damp earth and distant industry. They stood for a moment, letting the mundane reality of the city wash over them. The sky was a muted gray, the buildings across the street a familiar, grimy brick. It was over. They had left the Chroma House, left the depot, left the impossible engine. Then, a flicker. A small, ordinary puddle on the cracked pavement before them. Its surface reflected the gray sky, but at its very edge, a sliver of impossible blue shimmered, too vibrant, too pure for the urban grime. It was the same blue that had once pulsed from the Chroma House's study walls. They touched the water. It was cool, wet, unremarkable. Yet, the blue persisted, a tiny, defiant shard of color in the reflection, refusing to blend with the gray. Chen stood slowly and scanned the street. The buildings across the way, the window frames, usually stark black, held a faint, barely there tint of ochre, similar to the one Chen had seen on the engine. A delivery truck rumbled past, its red paint appearing momentarily to possess an unnerving depth, a vibrancy that pulsed just beneath the surface, like a trapped light. The world was not off-kilter. It was seamed. Chen saw the edges, the places where reality was stitched together, where the fabric thinned. The ordinary became a veneer, a fragile skin over something else. The house hadn't just warped Chen's perception within its walls. It had imprinted itself upon Chen's very way of seeing. The colors, the shifts, the subtle, impossible angles. They were now part of Chen's visual lexicon. Chen walked, the pavement feeling strangely elastic beneath their feet. The air carried a faint, sweet metallic tang, a scent that had been present in the Chroma House's library. It was not a hallucination. It was a clarity, a new lens that peeled back the mundane. A compulsion, faint but persistent, began to tug at Chen. It was not a fear, but a resonance, a deep, magnetic hum from somewhere distant, yet intimately connected to Chen's own being. It was the house, calling, Or perhaps it was Chen, now perceiving the house not as a distant structure, but as a vast, pervasive network, its tendrils extending through the very air, through the light, through the ground beneath their feet. The Chroma House hadn't absorbed Chen's mind, but it had irrevocably altered it, making Chen a sensitive, a conduit. The horror had not ended. It had merely expanded its canvas, and Chen, now seeing the true shifting nature of the world, was its newest, most exquisite instrument.